Hello, everyone, and welcome to our continuation of what we saw last week, namely a comparison between the simple present and the present continuous. So, as we did last week, just to make sure you can follow more easily, we were following the table on page 3 of that verb basics document, right? And so last week, what we saw was, as I said, this comparison between the simple present and the present continuous, which was really the second and the third column in that table, right? And we looked at just the first three types of use. So if you remember, that involved a discussion of the comparison between present states and actions happening now, right? That was our first point of comparison, right? So that was the sort of the first row, right? For the simple present, we use that for a present state. The example we have here is something they agree. We don't say they are agreeing, right? Because agree is a stated verb, it refers to a state. Whereas when we use the present continuous, that will be compatible with an action that's happening now, such as when we describe events that are happening around us. He is running, he is eating, he is doing, whatever he is doing, right? Or she. So that was our first point of comparison, and then we came up to a second point of comparison, which was the compatibility of the simple present with what we referred to as atemporal use. And we talked about scientific truths such as water boils at 100 degrees, and then we went on to talk about sort of moral truths that are presented as being always true, like we find in maxims or in proverbs, right? And then we compared this to this more firm anchoring of actions happening now with the present continuous, right? And then finally, what we saw was this a similar use for the simple present to this atemporal use, being when we talk about things being true, I would say in general, for describing people's habits and behavior. What they often do, what they may perhaps rarely do, what they almost always do. But these aren't general truths that are true at any given point throughout the timeline. But nonetheless, they do involve some idea of more of an idea of permanence associated with stability of someone's character, right? And then once again, we compared this to what we referred to as sort of exceptional behavior, meaning let's say if we could say that someone in general smokes, right, we're going to use the simple present. They smoke. If we say tonight they are smoking, we're going to use the present continuous. And once again, this can become a little bit perhaps more ambiguous because we are no longer talking about what is happening exactly now, right? Because we're saying, for example, tonight, this person is smoking tonight, right? But at the same time, this sort of expansion of the present time that can go fairly far. We can talk about tonight or this week, maybe even this year, right? There is always this sort of implicit opposition with what happens in general, and that's what justifies, and that's what makes the use of be plus verb ing, which is the present continuous, more natural in that context. So that's just a review of what we saw last week that I'm sure you remember. And as I said, that those are the three, I would say, bread and butter, main uses of, or the three main oppositions when we're talking about the way we use the simple present and the present continuous. And as I said, we were going to look at three less, I would say, less major uses. Some of these are sort of minor, and they're rarely used in sort of specific context. So we're going to move on to that. So the first opposition we find, right, we're on number 4, and which we find on this verb basics document, is the opposition between future scheduled events and future and future planned events. Now this needs to be explained more in detail. First of all, here we're talking about future time, right? So we have the timeline, which I know that it's really difficult to be legible. I just want to have some idea of a pictorial representation. So here we have the timeline. So here we have sort of on this side, we have sort of the future, and here we have sort of the past, right? Okay. So up until now, we've been involved with using, we're talking about using the present tense, and we're talking about the present time. It might be debatable as far as what we mean by present time when we talk about, the atemporal present, when we talk about, the use of, let's say, the simple present to express a scientific law, because that's true sort of everywhere in the timeline, right? So there are actually questions that we are led to ask between the difference between the verb form we use, right, what we might want to call the present tense, and the time that this refers to on the timeline, right? So that means we need to talk about this distinction between what we call time, and time is what we call in French temps réel, and tense, which is temps grammatical. And we're going to talk more about this next week, because we're going to look at the past tense, right? We're going to look at the ways that we use the past tense, right? So for the time being, we've only really studied the meaning of the present tense, right? And for now, we've just said, well, it generally refers to what's happening now, sometimes we're talking about exactly now at the very present time, and we can sort of expand this present, but it's, this notion of how narrow the time frame is, how closely this is linked to the exact present time. These are questions we might ask, but given any rate, we're still talking about the present time, and largely speaking. So what we have seen is that we're talking about the present form of the verb. Now we're going to talk about this more in detail, right? Because from your experience, and we've briefly talked about verb forms, we've seen that there is a past form of a verb, right? For example, if we look at the example we saw in the second column of present habits and characteristics, we had the example, they smoke, right? Okay. We see that that's the verb phrase is smoke, right? And we notice that it's in the present tense. And we can show that by changing our subject from they to he or she or it, right? Or we could say she smokes. And we notice that there is verbal agreement between the subject, she, and the verb form, because we have our S, what we call the S morpheme. Well, we could talk about that more in detail. It will help you in phonetics. So the idea being that there is what we call verbal agreement, right? When we have this S, right, that appears in with third person singular, that only occurs in the present tense, right? And so here we're talking about this form of the verb, right? So the question, and likewise, if we use the past tense, we notice that this is reflected because we have the past form of the verb. They smoked, right? And this being a regular verb, we have this, what we call the ed suffix, right? That indicates that we have this past form. So we've seen that we have sort of two verb forms, right? One is the present form and one is the past form. We'll talk more about the meaning of these two verb forms later. And that's what we call the tense. So the tense is really the form of the verb, right? And we'll explain this more later, but for the time being, try to retain this idea that there are only two tenses in English. We only have two specific verb forms. We have the present form of the verb and the past form of the verb, okay? And this is different from French. If you remember, in French we have the, we talked about le présent simple, we talked about le passé simple, et il y a aussi un futur simple qui a une forme consacrée par, si on compare le futur proche, je vais aller quelque part, j'irai quelque part, c'est le futur simple. Et du coup, on constate en français qu'il y a trois formes verbales associées à ce verbe. In English, it's different. We only have two verb forms. So what that means is we use not exclusively, but very often we can use the present to talk about the future, right? And that's actually what happens with the futur proche. Je vais aller quelque part. Here we have a composed tense. We have vais, aller. Vais is the present form of aller, which is the auxiliary verb, right? Okay, and it's important to note that the verb form we use to construct the futur proche is a present form of the verb, right? So something similar happens in English when we're talking about future time, because as we've seen, that we're looking at sort of the system, the verb system in English, right? We have, of course, the past tense and the present tense, right? We only have those two forms, right? But of course, that doesn't mean that that future time doesn't exist in English. So hopefully, the way I said time there can make you aware of the fact that when we talk about tense, and this is what we're going to talk about and refer to as in French as ton grammatical, which is just the form of the verb, right? Okay. And in English, we only have two tenses. We only have two verb forms, present and past. On the other hand, when we talk about what's happening in the real world, right? Okay, we still have the notions, right, of present, past, and future, right? And when we're talking about time, we're talking about the way we represent, time is, we could write books on what time is. I'm not going to get into it, but we all have sort of a mental representation of present, future, and past, right? So we do have a mental representation in English, just like in all languages, or in all societies, I should say, of the future, but we don't have a verb form that is devoted to it, right? So what are we going to do? Most often we're going to use present verb forms. So the one that we use the most, right, is going to be the progressive, right? So, and this we see in our example here. We're looking at row 4. Here we have future planned events, right, for the fourth use of the present progressive. And our example is they're coming tomorrow, right? So in our example, the verb phrases are coming, right? So that's be plus verb ing. So that is the present continuous, right? So we'd say, oh, we just look at the verb form. We look at are. We say, oh, that is the present form of to be. So that means the tense of this verb phrase is the present. And I'm only talking about the verb form. I'm not asking myself when something happens on the timeline. That's a question of time, right? So I'm using the present form of the verb because I have the present continuous. That's just that refers to what verb form I'm using. But the event that we're talking about, they're coming tomorrow, in this context, everyone understands that especially because we have a time marker, tomorrow, right? We are talking about something that is going to happen in the future, right? So we will very often use be plus verb ing, which is a present tense, to talk about future time. Okay. Now the important thing to note is that we use be plus verb ing when we're talking about events that are already planned, that are already foreseen when the speaker talks about them, right? So this is where we can come across a few slightly interesting nuances because we have other ways of expressing the future. And the best comparison here, the most stark comparison, will be between using be plus verb ing, which we use for planned events. If I say they are coming tomorrow, this is something that we have already accounted for. This is something that we already foresee, right? But on the other hand, an example of something sort of more spontaneous would be, let's say if someone asks me, yes, what are you doing this weekend? And I would never say, oh, I don't know, I'm going to, right? I would never, if I don't know, if this thing was not planned, I would never use be plus verb ing. I would say, I don't know, I'll go to the country. And notice I'll is I will. So will is for future non-planned events. So that's an important, this is something you can add sort of to the side of this table that we have here, is this opposition between future planned events with be plus verb ing, right? And will with events that are not planned. And notice, by the way, there's a neat little coincidence that, we've talked about the importance of the will when we talked about the difference between states and actions. Here, notice will is actually a modal. We talked about this modal construction. So then modal construction is will plus the verb stem, right? I will do something tomorrow, right? And it usually expresses this idea of, once again, there's a coincidence between this modal verb will and the noun will, which is la volonté, right? So usually when we use, there's an adjacent concept at work when we say, oh, I'll go to the country tomorrow. Notice the person just decided, right? This is something that hadn't been decided before because it's not planned. Now, the act of making a decision is an act of the will, right? So that means that there can also be a supplementary idea when we use the future with will. It can also be there to a greater or lesser extent. This can also be an expression of the speaker's will, right? Think of the civil rights movement, right, that you're all familiar with, right? We have the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, right? And we have this, we have, the civil rights activists saying, we shall overcome. I will succeed, right? So that is both an expression of a future event, right? And it can also be an expression of the will. And this idea will be absent from when we have B plus verb ing. So another example of when we're going to use this type of the future with will, right, using the modal will be when we're kind of reacting to what's happening around us, right? And this is important. This will really help out your everyday English, because this is something that you might not hear, because you might not hear it. It might lead you to express yourself less well than you can. So let's say, for example, we are discussing something, and let's say you drop your pen. Your pen drops on the floor, and so I'm going to propose to get this to you. So notice, I'm going to sort of comment on what I'm doing, and just before I reach down to get your pen, I'll say, "Oh, I'll." And notice this is I apostrophe LL, I will, right? And you might not hear it. I'm not saying I get that for you. I'll get that for you. And this is yet another use of this, a specific use of the future here, where there is this expression of the will. On peut dire la bonne volonté, et c'est presque une forme de politesse. J'exprime ma bonne volonté de faire quelque chose sur le champ, et comme en opposition avec B plus verbe ing, c'est quelque chose que je viens de décider de faire, parce que c'était pas prévu que vous laissez tomber votre stylo. D'accord? Donc je réagis par rapport à ce qui se passe, je prends une décision, c'est un acte de volonté, et non seulement c'est un acte de bonne volonté, mais je dirais c'est un acte de bonne volonté. Right? These are things that we use all the time. Oh, I'll do that for you. I'll get that for you. Oh, I'll call them, right? So notice that this is, we're reacting, right, to what's going around us, and we're sort of also expressing this idea of goodwill, right? So the will doesn't necessarily to be sort of an expression of strong determination, as it is in, our sentence we looked at associated with the civil rights movement, we will overcome, right? It can in another context, be the expression of this idea of, I think the most convenient expression is la bonne volonté, right? Goodwill. What we could say in English too. So that should give you an example of the sort of the context where we use this. I will give you some exercises to work on with this. Now, notice we are coming back to our other verb form that we are comparing B plus verb ing with. So we needed to make sort of a segue into this expression of another future form, because it's the time to really understand what we mean when we say that B plus verb ing is planned, because that's opposed to this idea of non-planned events with will, right? And then we have and now coming back to the comparison between B plus verb ing and the simple present, right? There's something that you should really keep in mind. These are things that are really going to help out your sort of everyday English, and it's important that you're at home with these ways of using the present to talk about the future. You will notice that there is an example of the use of the simple present for the future. Now, I should say that this is a very rare use. I would almost suggest that you don't do it at all, because it is only in certain contexts, and it's extremely rare, that you are going to use the simple present to talk about the future, right? Otherwise, you will sound a little bit like, Tarzan talking about what he wants to do. So what kind of example is this? Now, it's sort of a subcategory of these planned events that we talked about. We could say not only is the event planned, we could say it's scheduled. It's something, and notice this is the only time we do this. So this is fairly rare. I almost hesitate to teach this to you, but you're English specialists and you should be aware of the different ways we can use these verbs. So in rare circumstances, for example, if I have a schedule, let's say like a bus schedule, right? I can say, oh yeah, the bus arrives at 8, right? So I will exceptionally, when I say arrives, I'm using the simple present, right? So only in these rare situations, or if I'm saying, we're going to look at a movie tonight. Oh yeah, the movie begins at, 7 at night, right? So in this case, I notice I can also use B plus verb ing. It's completely correct to say the movie is beginning or the bus is arriving. But in these situations, it's sort of a more compact form, right? Because we are sort of referring to something kind of permanent as a schedule, right? Because of this idea of permanence, right? Many speakers will often, in these contexts, use the simple present. But keep it in mind that's an exception. No speaker will say, oh, this weekend I go to the country, right? It doesn't sound, hopefully you can hear that it's not natural. That is not something that appears on a schedule in this sort of fixed way, right? But since it is only planned, it is much more natural, and it isn't correct to say this weekend I go to it just is not grammatically correct. Every speaker will say, ooh, something sounds wrong with that sentence, right? But because it's only a planned event, not necessarily scheduled, right? Scheduled is some kind of formal, we're referring to it like a printed thing, right? Because it is only scheduled, it will be correct to say, this weekend I'm going to the country. So that's what you should really get used to using. What we call the bread and butter future form. To refer to the future is for generally planned events. We will most often use be plus verb ing, and you should just get used to using it like that. Oh, this weekend I'm doing that, and then we're doing this and such and thing. And we can use will, right? Also, but very often will is associated with this idea of something kind of more spontaneously decided on, right? Okay, with this expression of either determination or goodwill. So that is our sort of brief review, if you will, of the future, right? Okay, and we'll come back to that. These are important points to keep in mind. And so next we have two more ways that we use the present that we would like to look at. And we will look at that right away in our next video.